طيب there's not much left alhamdulillah, so like I didn't want to take you use too much time so that you guys can actually study. Last thing we were talking about was the phrenic and vagus nerves. قلنا إنه vagus nerve والphrenic nerve, one of the important differences between them, so that you can tell the difference between them in the DR يعني, is that the vagus nerve and the phrenic nerve have different relations to the hilum of the lung. يعني for example, if this was the lung, sorry for the bad drawing, and this was the root of the lung or hilum of the lung, and vagus nerve would go behind it while the vagus nerve would go behind it while the phrenic nerve would go in front of it. You would be able to tell the difference between the phrenic nerve and the vagus nerve. تمام? The one way to tell the difference. Another way is usually just to see if it attaches to the diaphragm or if it goes through the opening of the diaphragm. There's nothing else that's like very high yield about the phrenic and the vagus other than a root value of a phrenic nerve اللي هو قلنا قبل CR3, C4, C5. Which is يعني برضه super important. You know, the root value of the phrenic nerve is C3, C4, C5. It's a very common area of questions برضه. إذا عنده أي question في الحاجات اللي عملناها so far, or anyone who wants me to repeat. طيب. So زي ما قلنا أهم حاجة في vessels حقت الميدياستينم is the veins and the arteries. وبالذات الveins تعرف إنه البريكيوسيفاليك الاثنين بيصنعوا لنا البريكيوسيفاليك الاثنين بيتصنعوا from the subclavian and the internal jugular, and they form together the superior vena cava, and then the azygous vein drains into the superior vena cava. And we mentioned in our arch of the aorta has 3 branches. The first branch is the brachiocephalic artery, and then the left common carotid and the left the left subclavian. تمام. طيب يلا أنا gonna quickly and briefly برضو talk about the inferior mediastinum. قلنا the inferior mediastinum is anything below the angle of fluis or the sternal angle. قلنا هنقسمه ل anterior or middle or posterior based on the diaphragm. The pericardium, based on the pericardium. So if it's anterior to the pericardium, if it's in the middle of the pericardium, or if it's posterior to the pericardium. يلا anterior mediastinum الcontent حقه is not that much. There's the thymus gland, that's an important one. وفي internal thoracic vessels, which is an important one برضه. يعني الثايمس ذاتها قاعدة في الانتيريور وفي السوبيريور. في تاني الانترنال thoracic artery vein. Well, if you think about it common sense wise, an internal thoracic artery is actually sitting on the inside of the anterior thoracic wall, صح? So it's literally they're literally running here. صح? So it makes sense إنهم قاعدين في الانتيريور mediastinum، صح؟ ومعاها الثايمس اللي هي بتكون الثايمس اللي قاعدة في الاريا دي هنا. So قاعدة في السوبيريور وقاعدة في الانتيريور. تمام؟ في أي question عن الانتيريور؟
معلش ممكن تعيدي النت قطع.
طيب الانتيريور أعيد الانتيريور mediastinum ولا أعيد شنو؟
أيوه.
اوكي طيب يلا anterior mediastinum ده قاعد وين؟ هو الاريا below الsternal angle وin front of the pericardium. الكونتنت حقته ما حاجة مهمة يعني، لكن فيه الثايمس جلاند وفيه الانترنال thoracic artery وفين. يلا internal thoracic artery وفين ده احنا قبل اتكلمنا عنهم في ribs، صح؟ لما قلنا intercostal vessels intercostal veins و arteries، صح؟ يعني هم كانوا they literally run along الانتركوستال الانتيريور they run along the sternum. فعشان كده هم محلهم حرفيا هنا. So they're in front of the pericardium لكن behind the sternum. السكند structure is thymus gland اللي هي usually قاعدة في الاريا دي. So الثايموس gland بتكون قاعدة في السوبيريور وقاعدة في الانتيريور. تمام؟
تمام. Thank you.
اوكي تمام. ده الانتيريور. الميدل الكونتنت حقته الهارت والبريكارديوم ذات نفسه يعتبر في الميدل. So the middle one you have the heart, pericardium itself. معاه phrenic nerves and يلا في other contents that are not that important which are the great vessels as well. يعني part of the great vessels count. يعني the heart معاه great vessels ممكن نقول which are basically the aorta, the pulmonary artery, the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava. They can all count as part of the middle pericardium, middle mediastinum. The pericardium itself, we can count it as part of the middle, and then the phrenic nerves, which both pass right next to the heart, very close to the heart, and they'll pass here. So they count as part of the middle mediastinum. Again, the middle mediastinum contents are not that important. They're not really usually asked for, but I only mention them because, يعني, to be fair. يعني. تمام? Any questions about the anterior middle?
Did you say that the anterior mediastinum is in front of pericardium and behind what?
Yes, the anterior mediastinum is between the pericardium and the wall. So it's in front of the pericardium, while the middle pericardium is inside the pericardium, or like between the margins of the pericardium, while the posterior is behind the pericardium. Yeah? So if this is the pericardium, يعني, this is the middle, this is the anterior, this is the posterior. Sound good?
Yep.
آخر حاجة هنا posterior mediastinum, which is the one that's found behind the pericardium. The posterior mediastinum is one of the most important when it comes to contents, because they usually ask a lot about it, right? So it's between the pericardium with thoracic vertebrae. So أي حاجة that's moving near the thoracic vertebrae is technically part of the posterior mediastinum. And to remember it easily, they usually use the mnemonic dates. And so dates is basically D is for the descending aorta, A is for the azygous vein. لكن you also add with it the hemiazygous. So azygous vein plus the hemiazygous vein. There's the thoracic duct. So the T is for the thoracic duct, E is for the esophagus, and S is for the sympathetic trunk. Tamam? So these are the contents of the posterior mediastinum. Or an easy way to remember it is just dates. Well, so this is the high yield, super high yield, very common in exams to ask you to name or to mention the structure that's found in the posterior mediastinum. طبعا remember that anything that ends في bifurcation of the trachea مثلا, for example the trachea, you cannot say the trachea is in the posterior mediastinum. Now trachea أصلا بتنتهي في superior mediastinum. So يعني usually a superior mediastinum and posterior have common structures نازلة يعني continuing, but not all of them. Make sense?
Please
so the question would be something along the lines of, okay, يعني questions usually become mostly along the lines of all of the following is part of the posterior mediastinum except وبدخلك حاجة من superior mediastinum بتنتهي قبلها في superior, زي مثلا الtrachea. الtrachea starts هي قاعدة في superior لكن بتجيف قبل ما تصل posterior, so it doesn't reach the inferior part. عشان كده بيكون قبلها. لكن الأسوفاجس for example it continues all the way to the posterior, or like the azygos continues all the way and so on. That's like how it's usually asked. فهمتيني؟
أي.
Okay, تمام. يلا one last thing I want to say unrelated to like the thorax is إنه في this book اسمه black book. I'll send you guys a PDF of it. يلا black book ده it's a big book بتاع past papers. يلا دكتور هشام just loves it. بيجيب منه أسئلة كتير شديد. يعني if anyone is not confident about thorax, عايز to like try to solve some of it كده, and I would recommend you try to solve منه. However يعني thorax in general الامتحان ما بيجي فيه أكتر من يعني أسئلة كثيرة بيكونوا زي 10 questions بالكثير في الميد وفي الفاينل بيكونوا like 5 questions. So try to just يعني know the most important things. الحاجات detail دي هتشتغلوا شديد. عرفتوا؟ يعني أحسن الزول يكسب ثمنه ويقرأ head and neck و lower وكده. Got it? So يعني try to save your time and like study smarter. So if it's not that important, if it's not that detailed, يعني don't go too deep into the thorax. تمام? If anyone has any questions about anything in anatomy, يعني you guys are free to text me at any time. Or any other subject, to be honest. يعني I'm here to help. And yeah, thank you so much, you guys, for today's session.
Sorry, I have a question. Can you repeat the part of the superior and inferior, like trachea and esophagus?
Okay, so what I was saying قبل شوية was إنه في حاجات في structures that بيمشوا من the superior to the posterior, so they continue. While في structures they just stop at the superior. Yeah, for example, the trachea stops just at the superior, while the esophagus is going to go all the way down. Or for example, an arch of the aorta بيكون قاعد في superior and it continues as the descending aorta في inferior. Make sense? Okay.
يا مرام دكتور هشام بيجيب
أيوة.
البلاك بوك for the thorax ولا mainly even head and neck
فيه كله بيجيب من البلاك بوك في كل شيء. يعني هو بالذات الكويشنز الكلينيكال دي بيجيبها من البلاك بوك.
اوكي.
تمام. في زول عنده أي سؤال تاني؟ Any other questions?
Can
طيب
you
يا جماعة
mention بس الحاجات المهمة في ال intercostal nerves؟
Okay, يلا we'll go back to the intercostal nerves. يلا intercostal nerves أهم حاجة في إنه النيرف بتبدأ من ال posterior rami of the intercostal of the T region of the spinal cord. يعني مثلا بتيجي من T1 أو T2 أو كده. تمام؟ دي أول حاجة إن هي بتمرق من ال posterior rami. تمام؟ So that's one of the things they could ask you about. تمام؟ يلا بعدك what happens is that basically ال vein and nerve دي it continues along the intercostal groove all the way to the anterior. طيب؟ يلا الحاجة that confuses people is that it gives off branches. تمام؟ It gives off branches للskin, branches للmuscles. تمام؟ البرانشز اللي بتمشي skin نسميها cutaneous branches. So في lateral وفي medial branches. في تاني البرانش للمصل. تمام؟ يعني في extra branches. يلا لما أي intercostal nerve تدي branch غير البرانشز ديل كده دي بنسميها atypical intercostal nerve. تمام؟ يلا دي حاجة بتلخبط الناس إنه في حاجة اسمها atypical intercostal nerve. atypical intercostal nerve دي شنو بتدي nerve لحاجة برا الثوركس. تمام؟ That's how I remember it. إنه بتدي nerve لحاجة برا الثوركس. زي مثلا ال first intercostal nerve بتدي brachial plexus صح؟ معناته intercostal nerve is an atypical nerve. A second intercostal nerve بتدي ال upper limb برضو. في nerve واحدة اسمها دقيقة kind of forgot 1 second. nerve اسمها what is it called? Does anyone remember the nerve name? It's a nerve that supplies the skin of the anterior of the upper limb. والله ما بتذكر معلش. الثيرد لحد التنث لا سوري لحد السكس are typical. تمام. بعد ذاك من السفنث وانتوا نازلين لحد ال11th then they supply the anterior abdominal wall. they supply the diaphragm. عشان كده بيبقى اسمهم atypical. ال12 اصلا it doesn't do any of the things المفروض تعملها يعني it doesn't even supply الانتركوستال spaces لانه ما في intercostal space تحتها so it's just a subcostal اسمها subcostal and it doesn't count typical. so يعني الtypical typical. بعد ذاك الباقيات are atypical because they supply something extra. So the first one supplies the brachial plexus, the second one supplies the upper limb. At 7th and 11th, they supply the anterior abdominal wall and the diaphragm. While 12th one supplies the subcostal nerve. Now it's a subcostal nerve, so it goes to the abdominal wall. It doesn't supply anything in the thorax. Make sense?
Can we repeat it again?
Okay, طوالي. So what happens في intercostal nerves is that من posterior rami of the spinal cord. Sorry, what? معلش. Is it posterior or anterior? It's posterior, posterior rami of the spinal cord, and it runs in the groove all the way to the anterior part. Come on, and along the way it gives muscular branches, and it gives cutaneous branches. Huh? And cutaneous branches for the skin, and muscular branches is for the intercostal muscle. It also gives visceral branches جوا البلورا اللي هم pleural branches. تمام? So the typical ones only do these three things. So they only supply an intercostal space and skin around the skin of the chest and the pleura. Anything else that supplies any of these intercostal nerves that supplies an extra area بنسميها atypical nerve. Like the first one supplies the brachial plexus. The second one supplies the upper limb. It has just this tiny little area in the upper limb where it supplies it. Well, they supply. Well, the 12th one doesn't count as an intercostal at all. It counts as a subcostal because there is no 12th subcostal. ما في 12 intercostal space. Make sense? يعني عشان كده ده الكلاسيفيكيشن حق النيرفز.
Okay, thank you.
أو you know that it's not that important يعني ممكن الانفورميشن اللي اديتكم لا تكون كفاية عادي. You don't have to go back and study about it. I don't think I've ever come across questions كده فيه يعني. طيب يا جماعة thank you guys so much. يلا I want to ask you guys أحسن لنا نشتغل بكرة ولا wait until after عيد؟
I think
يعني tomorrow's عرفة.
I think بكرة أحسن.
بكرة.
خلاص if you guys want أحسن لكم نشتغل بكرة ممكن نشتغل بكرة at 7 برضه. تمام؟ نتيم الثوركس and then take a عيد holiday. تمام. So tomorrow. Cool. Thank you guys.